Skepticism has proven to be an innovation within epistemology throughout the history of philosophy. Almost nobody holds the belief that skepticism is true. In other words, the idea that we can't come to really know anything at all. However, that doesn't negate the importance or relevance of skepticism. The function skepticism has in our day-to-day life is methodological. By examining skeptical arguments and seeing either how they fail or why they don't, we come to improve our understanding of what it means to know something, or even to be justified in a belief. We're forced to analyze not only our beliefs, but more importantly, the methodologies used to arrive at them. As insufficient justifications and bad ideas are washed away in the waves of skepticism, one must ask, are insufficient justifications, false beliefs, and bad ideas the only things being washed away within these skeptical waves? For now, I leave that an open question as I further pursue this inquiry of skepticism. Skepticism comes in many varieties. Academic skepticism from Plato's Academy takes on a positive claim, that claim being that we don't know about the nature of reality independent of our own immediate experience. Pyrrhonian skepticism is more cautious. It doesn't deny that we have knowledge. Instead, it recommends the suspension of judgment. Skeptical arguments include the evil demon thought experiment and the dream argument from René Descartes' first Meditations on Philosophy, Gilbert Herman's brain in a vat thought experiment, the problem of other minds, which comes in two versions, and many more. One of the motivating factors of skepticism is known in philosophy as epistemic circularity. Epistemic circularity occurs when a subject comes to arrive at a belief in a source's trustworthiness through the source itself. Two simple examples of epistemic circularity would be someone arriving at a belief that a used car salesman is honest because he said that he was, or a religious person arriving at a belief that their holy book is true because it says so in their holy book. It's easy to think that epistemic circularity delegitimizes any belief tainted by it. After all, this is the fallacy of begging the question, and intuitively, we shouldn't hold beliefs which are arrived at through fallacious reasoning. The problem with this intuition, though, is that an argument for total skepticism can easily be grounded in it. Let's suppose F1, F2, F3, and so on represent a subject's cognitive faculties, of which the subject has a limited number. In order to know that F1 is a reliable source of knowledge, the subject will have to use either F1 or another faculty. But if the subject uses F1 to justify his belief in F1 being reliable, his belief that F1 is reliable will be epistemically circular. So instead, the subject must use, say, F2. But the subject shouldn't use F2 unless he knows that it's a reliable source of knowledge. But in order to come to know this, the subject will have to use F1, F2, or some other faculty. But the subject can't use F2 on pain of epistemic circularity, and the subject can't use F1 without first knowing that it's a reliable source of knowledge, which is still in question. So the subject must use another source, perhaps F3. But clearly, the same issues will arise with respect to F3 as did F1 and F2, and the subject will eventually run out of faculties to which he hasn't already appealed. Epistemic circularity is inescapable. If it's really as bad as it seems, then skepticism is correct. Our epistemic foundations are fatally compromised. If you haven't already, consider the fact that perception, logic, and reason are in fact cognitive faculties. If we want to justify our belief that perception is reliable, we can't use perception to do so, or else we're being epistemically circular. So we must instead use, say, reason. But we shouldn't use reason unless we know that it itself is a reliable source of knowledge. But in order to come to know this, we'll have to use perception, reason, or some other faculty. But we can't use reason on pain of epistemic circularity. Nor can we use perception since its reliability is still in question, so we must use another source, perhaps logic. But clearly, the same issues will arise with logic as did perception and reason, and we will eventually run out of faculties to which we can appeal. One approach used as a rebuttal to skepticism is epistemic externalism, which is the negation of epistemic internalism. There's a distinction between internalism or externalism about justification and internalism or externalism about knowledge. Internalism about knowledge maintains that for a justified true belief to be knowledge, the subject must be able to know that his belief is justified. According to externalism about knowledge, for a subject to have knowledge, the justification condition must hold, but it isn't necessary that he be able to know that it holds. In other words, a subject can be justified in a belief without knowing why he's justified. Under this view, as long as perception, reason, and logic are reliable, we can come to have knowledge through the use of these faculties. We don't have to know that logic and reason are reliable in order to have knowledge. They just have to be reliable. This does, of course, point out the fact that we can't really differentiate between the propositions we know and the propositions we justifiably believe. So we can think we know of a proposition when in fact we don't, and we can know of a proposition when in fact we don't realize that we do. In my opinion, internalism about knowledge fails because of the infinite regress problem. If in order to know that P, I have to know that I know that P, then in order to know this, I must necessarily have to know that I know that P, and since there are an infinite amount of knows that this will entail, we necessarily could never get to having knowledge. In my view, epistemically circular beliefs are in fact problematic, however some of them we have to presuppose in order to get our feet off the ground in any given discussion. So we can accept that some of the foundations of our knowledge are epistemically circular and must be presupposed, but we should also strive to make as few presuppositions and have as few epistemically circular beliefs as possible. So when a presuppositional apologist uses his belief in God to justify his belief in God, I can still criticize him for his epistemic circularity, and if he responds criticizing me by appealing to hypocrisy, I can simply respond by explaining that we are not with respect to our cognitive faculties in a situation analogous to a customer in a used car lot or a person being presented with a holy book or an argument for a god. We must assume logic and reason work in order to arrive at any new beliefs, but we demonstrably don't have to assume that God exists in order to arrive at any new beliefs. The way the precept uses his God belief, I use logic and reason. Funny enough, if the precept tries to argue that I need God to have reason, he'll have to use reason to argue this, and in doing so will prove me to be correct. But I'm not here to debunk presuppositional apologetics. Doing so just works as an effective way of explaining my point. I realize that at this point, I've likely already given you quite a lot to take in and consider, and given the complexity, I want to be mindful of the effort that can sometimes be necessary for understanding anything that I've been talking about. But there are so many forms of skepticism worth refuting, or at least attempting to refute, that I wouldn't be comfortable without addressing at least one more skeptical argument, and so I'll be addressing what's known in philosophy as the problem of other minds. The problem of other minds goes as follows. Given that I can only observe the behavior of others, how can I know that others have minds? The problem is that knowledge of other minds is always indirect. A response or a solution to this problem posited by John Stuart Mill is known as the argument from analogy, and it goes as follows. Premise 1. There are patterns in my behavior in response to external stimuli which reveal that I'm having mental states of a certain sort. Premise 2. This same behavior in response to external stimuli is exhibited by others. Conclusion, these others experience the same mental states that I do, and so are minded just like me. Although initially persuasive, the argument from analogy runs into problems on closer inspection. For one thing, the style of argument being used here isn't a very good one, even if we set aside the worries one might have about inductive arguments. Compare the argument from John Stuart Mill with the following argument. Premise 1. Box A is brown, and it contains a book. Premise 2. Boxes B, C, and D are brown. Conclusion, boxes B, C, and D contain a book. Clearly, this is a very bad style of argument, and that the mere fact that one brown box contains a certain item doesn't give us any reason to think that any other brown box contains that sort of item. The problem with this argument is that it only considers a particular instance of a brown box, an instance which we have no reason to think is representative of brown boxes in general. Notice, however, that the following argument would be okay. Premise 1. Lots of brown boxes have been observed over many years and in a wide range of environments, and they have all contained books. Premise 2. Boxes B, C, and D are brown. Conclusion, boxes B, C, and D contain a book. Keep in mind, I'm not claiming that the first premise of this argument is true. Rather, I'm making an unsound but deductive argument as a way of making a point. If it were true that we had observed a representative range of brown boxes and found them all to have a book in them, then there would be no problem with concluding that any other brown box we find would also have a book in it. This knowledge paired with materialism gives us a sufficient refutation for skepticism about other minds. Premise 1. Lots of human brains have been observed over many years and in a wide range of environments, and they have all been composed of the same material makeup, and have proven to be the cause of our experience of stimulation. Premise 2. My brain, your brain, and anyone else's brain are composed of the same materials and activity giving rises to experiences such as stimulation. Conclusion: me, you, and whoever else you can think of have minds. I'm Shane the Skeptic, and I thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you'd like to support this channel and help me make more content but can't afford to do so monetarily, please keep in mind that liking, subscribing, and sharing this video are also effective ways of supporting this channel. Thank you.